Hi, everyone. Welcome to the press conference. We're still having a few people joining, but we'll start shortly. So right before we start, I just want to mention a few housekeeping items. So please mute your microphone if you're not speaking. And if you have any question or comment, please feel free to drop it in the chat box or use the hand button. And Kate Lappin, who's the moderator, will call you to speak. And speakers, there is a speak slowly so people can understand you. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the floor to Kate.
Thanks, Tramita. And welcome everybody to this virtual press conference, these new innovations that we have to try because of of course, the pandemic has forced us to locate ways that we can communicate across the region, but actually sometimes it provides us with a benefit of being able to bring voices from different countries together on an issue that is impacting on workers from all across Asia Pacific. I'm Kate Lappin. I am the Regional Secretary for Public Services International, which is the global union federation that covers workers and their unions who deliver public services across a range of public services. And this press conference is hosted by Unions for Trade Justice, which is a network of the global unions and their affiliates across Asia Pacific, all coming together in a joint campaigns around reshaping trade and attempts to ensure that we have a fairer trade justice agenda. Today we've come together particularly because it looks very likely that governments in the region will sign onto a new mega trade agreement on the 15th of November at the end of the ASEAN summit. And they'll be signing the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a trade agreement that's been negotiated now for several years, that started as the ASEAN +6, so all the 10 ASEAN countries and their 6 major trading partners, but has now become ASEAN +5. So the 10 ASEAN countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, and China. So this is the sort of alternative to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that was led primarily by the US. India decided not to sign. It was part of the negotiations, but decided that this trade agreement was not in the interests of their own industries, but also in the interests of workers and communities. And despite, really spending a number of years negotiating, India withdrew. Before I go to the panelists we have, let me just provide a little bit of a context around the concerns I think that trade unions in the region have had, together with a range of communities and civil society that trade unions have been collaborating with, which we will outline a bit more about today. Unions have come together to put together a statement, and we'll be able to release that and share it with you all, that outlines some of these concerns. Basically, I think the main concerns that unions have had about these trade agreements, and for decades now, is that they reflect the interests of multinational corporations who have been part of drafting them and certainly providing the language that goes into these trade agreements, and that they clearly are to the benefit purely of foreign investors, not even domestic businesses. In doing that, they ensure a race to the bottom for wages and conditions, and a couple of our speakers will cover a little bit more about that today, what it means both for countries who are engaged in that race to the bottom and are able to attract investment based on the lowest possible wages and conditions. So we will hear from a worker in Cambodia but also what it means to countries who have had manufacturing industries that have now been outsourced. And we'll hear from the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union. But these trade agreements are not only about trade. In fact, increasingly, they are very little to do with trade. Instead, they impose new rules on governments. They impose new rules in the way that they can pass public policies in relation to labour, in relation to the environment, and in relation to public services, in relation to how governments manage the economy. And the purpose is of trade agreements is claimed to be the ability to set common rules across countries. And those rules are very clearly rules that are neoliberal and constrain not only current governments but future governments that may want to perhaps introduce new public services, introduce new regulations that would perhaps expand protections for either public services or the environment, for workers, but even new areas that we can't imagine yet, like digital trade. How do we protect data? What data might look like for a public good? So that where governments are currently signing in ways that constrain future governments. And we know that people haven't seen the detail of these trade agreements. They have not been released, but parliamentarians have not either. And so we've invited a parliamentarian to speak on the panel today about what it means for democracy and what it means for future governments who might be able to, who would like to introduce new policies and economic rules. So we will, before I go to the panel, we do have a video. We were hoping to have a speaker from the Senate in the Philippines who's not been able to make it today. And I should also acknowledge that there's been further environmental devastation in the Philippines today, which is stopping some people from attending, including our own colleagues. But we were able to get a video from Senator Riza, who's been an advocate for trade justice and for workers' rights. In addition to raising concerns about the RCEP and other trade agreements, she has been talking about what governments need to do in light of the pandemic and what kind of rules governments should be introducing at the moment. So we are particularly concerned about the fact that governments are going ahead and signing on to this trade agreement in a time where it's been very clear that governments have had to actually contravene some existing trade rules in order to deal with the pandemic, whether that relates to manufacturing of essential goods, medicines, and other inputs, whether it means taking over services that have failed in aged care, for example, or other health services that have been privatised. Even airlines and so forth in some countries have had to be taken back into public hands, all of which could be construed as breaches of trade agreements. And instead, we believe that governments should be coming together and collaborating. There are very clearly agreements that need to be made across governments, but instead they should be agreements that allow for greater public good. And one of those is ensuring that governments can have access to the vaccine and other inputs for to deal with COVID. And there has been a proposal by India and South Africa that governments should all agree that they can use flexibilities that the World Trade Organization includes so that they can all have access to generic vaccines and medicines, and that whatever vaccines are available and other inputs should be shared, and that the intellectual property should be protections should be removed. And that is a prime example of why we shouldn't be signing trade agreements at the moment, when we know that in fact they further protect multinational corporations and their property rights. So I'll ask my colleague now to show us the video from Senator Riza, and then I'll go on to the panel.
This pandemic has shown us that we should never put the economy first before our people. We have to return to what's at stake when we talk about workers' rights. Workers are not means to an end. They are our people. Our people who in every way deserve to work for economic freedom with dignity and safety, who deserve to labor for their families in good health and with proper compensation, and who deserve to be included in major decisions and agreements that reflect these. Today, the GDP of the Philippines is at a painful negative 11.5%. The current regional comprehensive economic partnership worsens the trade balance, like through increasing the importation of unproductive luxury items and rice. We lose so many opportunities to obtain vital funds. Our people bear the brunt of any trade imbalance. The RCEP cannot be kept behind closed doors, especially because leaked documents show that several provisions limit the country's policy space. It's crucial that we create policy and fiscal space, especially for developing countries like the Philippines, at a time of tumultuous world and local economies that have produced historic hunger. It is of grave importance that this new generation free trade agreement be negotiated with the utmost transparency and always with respect for the rights of our workers. And only then can we, pandemic or not, begin to create an economy that everyone is able to partake in.
Great, thank you. I just saw a note that the speaker is too faint, so I will try and speak up. But yeah, we might, if it was the video that can't be heard, we can share that. I think we can share the link to the video. So I'm now going to ask Andrew Detmer, who is the National President of the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, to provide a perspective from Australia and why that his union, the AMWU, have been at the forefront of opposing this trade agreement and others that have a negative impact on workers. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Kate. And I'm coming to you from Aboriginal land, the traditional lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people in Brisbane, where I live. This RCEP deal is something which really has been negotiated almost in private. Despite the fact that we have governments telling us how good it is, the reality for us is that much of the detail is still unknown, and we won't see the full text in Australia, at least, until it's signed. We know that the summaries that were provided by our government tell us that the negotiations were completed last November, that is 12 months ago, before the pandemic, and that the text has not been revised in the light of the experiences of the pandemic. I can't vouch for the experience of other countries, but I certainly know that in Australia, our economy has been turned upside down by the pandemic. And this RCEP deal will simply increase imports and restrict local industry policies at a time when unemployment is rife and rising, and when issues of social dislocation are becoming quite manifest. We know that we need a strong manufacturing sector within Australia. As a representative of those manufacturing workers through the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, this pandemic has shown and thrown into sharp contrast the fact that as a country, Australia needs to depend less on imports and increase our local capacities. We need to be able to produce medical equipment and other essential products such as vaccines. For instance, we did not produce enough surgical masks to protect our own population, let alone the health workers who were so exposed to COVID during the course of the pandemic. We did not produce our own ventilators. Thankfully, we had companies which were prepared to switch to manufacturing those items, and we were able to do so fairly quickly. But the first couple of months were, as we say in Australia, touch and go. The issue for us is that the narrow range of products and services that we can produce will be lessened. That is, that narrowness will be increased, if you like, by what is going to happen out of the RCEP. And that will in turn increase our reliance on those same global supply chains which showed that they could not be relied upon in an emergency. Our union, the AMW, has always said that free trade agreements are not the panacea to our needs. And in fact, in manufacturing in Australia, what we've seen is a hollowing out of the manufacturing sector. What was once nearly a quarter of our economy is now down to less than 6%. And even though some of those changes may have happened anyway, that has been exacerbated and exaggerated by free trade agreements which the Australian government has continued to negotiate. And the RCEP will only see a continuation of that policy. We will then find ourselves really taken in a way that we think has of very little benefit to Australia, but it will be of great benefit to international capital. We are interested by India no longer being part of the RCEP, and what we think is that India not being part of it means that whatever positives may have arisen from it for Australia are not going to arise, for the simple reason we don't have free trade agreement with India. We do have free trade agreements with most of the other RCEP partners, and that really indicates to us that the RCEP is possibly going to be even worse. What we also say is that the RCEP has no commitments to any labour rights or environmental standards. And we notice that, for instance, the deal, which includes China and Myanmar, there is mounting evidence of labour rights and human rights abuses. We're also aware that other countries have not observed the basic ILO 8 conventions. And this is completely unacceptable. And also, there are no provisions dealing with forced labour or child labour, and there's no mention of the issue which really is taking up a hell of a lot of time in Australia at the moment, which is climate change. There is no mention of that, and we have an Australian government which is putting its head in the sand when it comes to climate change. What our government is claiming is that the main benefit of the agreement is that it gives a common set of legally binding trade rules for the region. However, they go far beyond traditional trade issues. They open up essential services like health, education, water, energy, digital services, financial services, to private foreign investors, and restrict the ability of future governments to be able to regulate them in the public interest. We say that's wrong. It's so wrong that governments would no longer have the flexibility to deal with crises like pandemics and climate change. Our government in Australia has failed to commission any independent studies about the economic and social costs and benefits of the RCEP in Australia. That means for us, it is impossible to judge objectively whether the agreement will benefit the Australian economy as a whole, let alone the most vulnerable workers and the communities in our recession, which has been caused by the pandemic. For us, this is continuation of business as usual by this government. The RCEP is a secretive and undemocratic process of negotiation. As I've said, it will only be released, that is, the text will only be released after the signing. And it will only be reviewed by a parliamentary committee which is dominated by the government, which can not change the text. It can only approve or reject. And their track record is that they approve anything which is proposed by the government's negotiators. And so government is absent from the process, governance is absent from the process, and Parliament will only vote on the implementing legislation, not the whole agreement. Our union, the AMW, is proudly opposed to these free trade agreements. We say trade should be fair. We know that there are many, many trading nations with whom we trade, and we say that is the lifeblood of our economy. But these free trade agreements allowing large corporations to come in to impose their rights and their rules on us and also on our colleagues in other RCEP countries is an indication of how flawed this proposed agreement is. We are urging all governments to reject this and to make this an open process. After all, in Australia, as we say, if it's that good, why not tell us what's in it? Thank you very much. And Kate, I'm very happy to answer any questions which may arise after the other speakers have spoken. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. I think I'll take the perspective from Cambodia before we go to questions, but please, if anybody would like to ask a question, just use the hand or you can type it in. But if you use the hand, I'll come to you afterwards. So Andrew, I think really well effectively raised the concerns of workers in manufacturing in Australia, but also the concern that this agreement does not include any kind of protections for workers, but it includes countries that routinely violate labour rights, including Cambodia. For some countries, as Andrew mentioned, these rules aren't particularly new because Australia and other countries have already signed a number of trade agreements with the partners. But for some countries, including Cambodia, a number of rules are quite new in here. They don't, though, include any protections for workers. And Cambodia is a country where, for example, in the EU, there's significant moves to remove some of the benefits that the country has because as a trading partner, purely because of its violations of labour and democratic rights. So I think it would be appropriate then to also hear from a worker who is representing a trade union in Cambodia, particularly in the garment industry, which is one of the industries that Cambodia hopes to grow as a result of the agreement, and to hear from her experience around both organising workers and as a worker at the moment in a country that's really determined to grow on the back of garment workers. So Charia has joined us and she will have a translator with her. So we'll hear from her via a translator, an interpreter, sorry.
Hello ខ្ញុំឈ្មោះចរិយាខ្ញុំជាកម្មករនៅកម្ពុជាហើយនាងខ្ញុំធ្វើការបានរយៈពេល18ឆ្នាំហើយនៅរោងចក្រធំចាហើយអំឡុងពេលដែលខ្ញុំធ្វើការនៅរោងចក្រធំហ្នឹងរោងចក្ររបស់ខ្ញុំហ្នឹងមានព្យួរការងារស៊ី 50% ចាហើយអំឡុងពេលព្យួរការងារហ្នឹងរោងចក្រធំរបស់ខ្ញុំហ្នឹងគឺមានការដឹកទំនិញទៅខាងក្រៅចាហើយរោងចក្រដែលខ្ញុំធ្វើការនៅរោងចក្រធំហ្នឹងកម្មករហ្នឹងគឺមានចំនួន2000នាក់ហើយពួកខ្ញុំហ្នឹងមានកុងត្រារយៈវេលាមិនកំណត់ចាហើយក្នុងហ្នឹងខ្ញុំបានទទួលអត្ថប្រយោជន៍ផ្សេងៗជាច្រើនហើយមានធានារ៉ាប់រងគ្រោះថ្នាក់ការងារហើយនិងធានារ៉ាប់រងសុខភាពរោងចក្រដែលខ្ញុំផលិតឲ្យហ្នឹងគឺមានម៉ាកល្បីអញ្ចឹងបន្ទាប់រហូតដល់ឆ្នាំ2018នៅខែមេសារោងចក្ររបស់ខ្ញុំហ្នឹងគឺចាប់ផ្ដើមបិទ
So her name is Jaicharia. She used to work with a factory that's a main factory that have over 2,000 workers, and she's been working there for 18 years. And in that factory, they produce for the global brand. And while working there, she's receiving the minimum wage and others benefit, and also national social security fund that provided by the government and under the provision of the labor law. However, her factory has faced some issues around suspension with 50% minimum wage. So worker has received not a full wage during the suspensions of contract. But majority of those workers in the factory are having unlimited specified contract. So they have a long-term contract. And while the factory having suspensions, they are actually subcontracting and taken the product to outsourcing and subcontracting to sweatshops and other factory. Until 2018 in April, the factory finally closed and shut down.
ចានៅឆ្នាំ2018ហ្នឹងហើយរោងចក្រខ្ញុំធ្វើការហ្នឹងក៏ចាប់ផ្ដើមបិទដូចនេះទៅពេលបិទរោងចក្រធំហ្នឹងក៏មានបើកសិប្បកម្មនៅចិត្តហ្នឹងដែរហើយខ្ញុំក៏បានចូលធ្វើការនៅក្នុងសិប្បកម្មហ្នឹងហើយក្នុងសិប្បកម្មហ្នឹងមានកម្មករប្រហែលជា100នាក់ហើយយើងចូលធ្វើការហ្នឹងគឺមិនចាំមានកិច្ចសន្យាអីទេចាហើយតម្លៃឡូហ្នឹងគឺយើងធ្វើទទួលតាមបរិមាណផលិតយើងអត់មានអត្ថប្រយោជន៍ដូចនៅរោងចក្រធំទេដូចជារបបសន្តិសុខសង្គមអីក៏យើងអត់ទទួលបានហើយការធ្វើការវិញគឺយើងធ្វើការ7ថ្ងៃក្នុងមួយសប្តាហ៍ហើយមួយថ្ងៃហ្នឹងគឺយើងធ្វើការពី10ម៉ោងទៅ12ម៉ោងហើយសម្ភារៈដែលយើងផលិតនៅក្នុងសិប្បកម្មហ្នឹងគឺដូចនៅក្នុងរោងចក្រធំហ្នឹងអត់មានខុសគ្នាទេ
So after her factory closed in 2018, then she started working at the sweatshop, and the sweatshop that actually established not too far from the factory that she used to work. In the sweatshop, there's no contract, and she works on piece rate, and there's no access to National Social Security Fund that provided in terms of injury at work and health care and also maternity benefit. While she's don't have those access to wage and also benefit, in fact, the product that being produced in the sweatshop is exactly the same products that's being produced in her factory that she used to work before.
ចាហើយនៅសិប្បកម្មមិត្តភ័ក្តិដែលខ្ញុំធ្វើការដែលគាត់ឈប់ពីរោងចក្រធំធ្វើការហ្នឹងយើងឃើញថាតំណែងមួយចំនួនដែលផលិតរួចហ្នឹងគឺត្រូវបានដឹកទៅវៀតណាមចាហើយបន្ទាប់ពីហ្នឹងហើយនៅក្នុងឆ្នាំ2020អំឡុងពេលផ្ទុះកូវីដហ្នឹងមកតំណែងហ្នឹងគឺចាប់ផ្ដើមឡើងថ្លៃហើយរោងចក្រមួយចំនួនគឺត្រូវបានពន្យល់ការងាររោងចក្រធំជួការងារមានខ្លះបិទរោងចក្រហើយមួយចំនួនទៀតហ្នឹងគឺបានផ្ដាច់កិច្ចសន្យាកម្មករហើយការផ្ដាច់កិច្ចសន្យាហ្នឹងគឺរោងចក្រហ្នឹងគាត់អត់បានទូទាត់ត្រឹមត្រូវតាមច្បាប់ស្ដីពីការងារឲ្យកម្មករទេហើយរោងចក្រមួយចំនួនដែលគាត់បិទហ្នឹងក៏អត់បានផ្ដល់ហើយរោងចក្រខ្លះគាត់បិទទៅក៏គាត់បានផ្ដល់
So in the sweatshop where she works 7 days a week. And in another, she has a colleague who work in another sweatshop. Some of the product that they have produced is not exported to Europe, but actually transported to the neighboring country like Vietnam. And then the situation's getting worse when the COVID-19 has outbreak in the country because the cost of living is getting high. Many factories has been suspended their contract. Some of the workers been ended their contract with no proper compensation, and the cost of living is getting really high for the workers.
ចាហើយម្លងពេលស្ថានភាពកូវីដផ្ទុះហើយបូកជាមួយនឹងការដក EBA ពីប្រទេសកម្ពុជា 20% ហ្នឹងអញ្ចឹងមើលទៅយើងឃើញថារោងចក្រធំមួយចំនួននៅប្រទេសកម្ពុជាហ្នឹងគឺមានការព្យួរការងារច្រើនហើយនឹងបិទច្រើនហើយជាពិសេសគឺផ្ដាច់កិច្ចសន្យាកម្មករច្រើនមែនទែនហើយដូចជាខ្ញុំធ្វើការនៅក្នុងសិប្បកម្មអញ្ចឹងម្លងពេលហ្នឹងគឺសម្បូរការងារធ្វើប៉ុន្តែតម្លៃឡូហ្នឹងគឺយើងទទួលបានថោកទេអញ្ចឹងប្រាក់ឈ្នួលហ្នឹងក៏បើកមិនទៀងទាត់ដែរហើយស្ថានភាពរបស់ពួកខ្ញុំហ្នឹងគឺកាន់តែលំបាកអញ្ចឹងដោយសារតែពួកខ្ញុំអត់មានការធានារ៉ាប់រងសុខភាពអត់អីពេលដែលពួកខ្ញុំឈឺអញ្ចឹងទៅខ្ញុំត្រូវចំណាយលុយហើយបើកប្រាក់ឈ្នួលមិនទៀងទាត់ទៀតអញ្ចឹងពួកខ្ញុំត្រូវបានការបំណុលអញ្ចឹងនៅពេលដែលពួកខ្ញុំអត់មានលុយគឺខ្ញុំត្រូវការខ្ចីលុយគេមកដើម្បីដោះទាល់ដោះស្រាយជីវភាពប្រចាំថ្ងៃ
So when our country has faced the challenges where the European Union has withdrawn 20% of the everything but arm is the preferentials that the Union has been European Union has been provided, and COVID-19, hundreds of factories has been suspended. Some has been closed. However, the observation is her sweatshop is getting more work at the sweatshop. while there is more work produced at the sweatshop, the piece rate has been actually getting lower. It's not getting higher. So and also the wage that's being provided monthly, it's also not regular. So there's a lot of challenges for her in terms of coping with the living daily life, the living costs. And a number of workers, including herself, have to go with loan and getting more debt to just spending for the daily living costs.
អញ្ចឹងពាក់ព័ន្ធជាមួយនឹងខ្ញុំធ្វើការយូរហើយពាក់ព័ន្ធជាមួយនឹងពាណិជ្ជកម្មសេរីហ្នឹងគឺចង់និយាយថារដ្ឋាភិបាលរបស់ខាងពួកខ្ញុំហ្នឹងគឺមានកិច្ចព្រមព្រៀងអញ្ចឹងពាណិជ្ជកម្មសេរីហ្នឹងគឺនាំឲ្យមានការប្រកួតប្រជែងជាខ្លាំងអញ្ចឹងរដ្ឋាភិបាលហ្នឹងត្រូវបន្ថយដើម្បីទាក់ទាញអ្នកវិនិយោគផ្ដល់អត្ថប្រយោជន៍ជាច្រើនដល់អ្នកវិនិយោគមានការលើកលែងពន្ធនាំចេញនាំចូលនិងជួយសម្រួលដល់អ្នកវិនិយោគអំឡុងពេលផ្ទុះ COVID និងការប្រកាសដក EBA របស់ខាងសហគមន៍អឺរ៉ុបហើយអ្នកដែលប៉ះពាល់ខ្លាំងជាងគេហ្នឹងគឺពួកខ្ញុំជាកម្មករចាព្រោះអីម្លងពេល COVID នៅពេលដែលរោងចក្រព្យួរការងារហ្នឹងរដ្ឋាភិបាលគាត់បានផ្ដល់ប្រាក់ឈ្នួលឲ្យខ្ញុំតែ$70ទេអញ្ចឹងវាអត់ស្របតាមប្រាក់ឈ្នួលបរិមាណទេហើយត្រូវរដ្ឋាភិបាលហ្នឹងក៏បានកំណែតម្រង់វិសោធនកម្មច្បាប់មួយចំនួនពាក់ព័ន្ធជាមួយនឹងកម្មករដែលគាត់ធ្វើការវេនយប់ហ្នឹងគឺផ្ដល់ប្រាក់ឈ្នួលឲ្យ100%ស្មើនឹងកម្មករវេនថ្ងៃហើយមួយទៀតតកតងនឹងការអត់លើកថ្ងៃឈប់ថ្ងៃបុណ្យថ្ងៃអាទិត្យគឺអត់លើកឈប់ថ្ងៃអាទិត្យគឺឈប់ថ្ងៃអាទិត្យអញ្ចឹងហើយមួយទៀតពន្យានៃការបើកប្រាក់រំលឹកអតីតភាពរហូតដល់ឆ្នាំក្រោយនិងវិសោធនកម្មច្បាប់ពាក់ព័ន្ធជាមួយនឹងសហុយសងជំងឺចិត្តនិងការជូនដំណុំមិនបានផ្ដល់ឲ្យកម្មករទេអញ្ចឹងកម្មករគាត់អត់បានទទួលអ្វីដែលទៅតាមច្បាប់ការងារ
So working in sweatshop, definitely there's no other access to other benefit and national security fund. However, this industry has been setting up in our country based on the free trade agreement. Despite whatever we have the existing agreement for export the product, the agreement has actually allowed Cambodia government to regulate a certain policy which attract more investor by providing more benefit, for example, in terms of exempting the import and export tax and providing tax holidays for the investor. And even during the COVID, there is so many facility and benefit to provide to the investor to cope with the crisis and also to cope with the situation where the EBA has been withdrawn. However, there's a lot of cut back for the workers because the wage and then the benefit, there is also amendment of the labor law, which is cut the profit of the worker who have the night working at night shift to the same wage as the day shift. They cut also the number of holidays, and also there's also amendment in terms of delay in terms of paying the compensations for workers, and other situation in which where providing more incentive and benefits to the company and the investor. To do that is just to ensure that the country will be able to stay in the competitive in this trade and also attract the investment and investor to continue to invest in the country.
ខ្ញុំចង់បន្ថែមទៀតខ្ញុំចង់បង្ហាញពីបទពិសោធន៍ដែលខ្ញុំធ្វើការជាង20ឆ្នាំហ្នឹងខ្ញុំធ្វើការតាំងពីរោងចក្រធំរហូតដែលខ្ញុំមានប្រាក់ឈ្នួលកខ្ញុំមានអត្ថប្រយោជន៍ផ្សេងៗពីបសសហើយពេលមានបញ្ហាអីមានអ្នកទទួលខុសត្រូវរហូតដល់ខ្ញុំធ្វើការរហូតដល់រោងចក្របិទហើយខ្ញុំបានឈានទៅដល់ធ្វើការសិប្បកម្មយើងអត់មានប្រាក់ឈ្នួលកយើងអត់មានការការពារយើងអត់ទទួលបានអត្ថប្រយោជន៍ពីបសសអញ្ចឹងអ្វីដែលយើងចង់បង្ហាញហ្នឹងគឺការធ្វើការនៅសិប្បកម្មហ្នឹងគឺអត់មានការគោរពសិទ្ធិអីអញ្ចឹងយើងប៉ះពាល់ខ្លាំងមែនទែនសម្រាប់កម្មករ
So the last final things that I wanted to say is that I am the worker that used to work in the main factory where I received the minimum wage that provided by the law and access to benefit, including the access to National Social Security Fund, where the health care will be also provided. But now I am actually pushed into working at sweatshop, which is where the subcontracting place that I don't get any benefit and access to the minimum wage that guaranteed by the law. And it's really a very, very difficult and challenging.
ខ្ញុំបន្ថែមទៀតមួយទៀតដោយសារខ្ញុំធ្វើការនៅក្នុងសិប្បកម្មហ្នឹងខ្ញុំក៏មានផ្ទៃពោះដែរអញ្ចឹងនៅពេលដែលខ្ញុំឆ្លងទន្លេខ្ញុំអត់បានទទួលអត្ថប្រយោជន៍អីពីខាងបសសទេ
So, and then the last, I wanted to also stress that currently I am pregnant, but in the sweatshop, since there's no National Social Security Fund benefit, so I won't be able to access to healthcare for free and also maternity benefit in this situation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chichiria and also Sita for translating. Well, congratulations on your pregnancy, but really that is an extraordinary pressure, I think, for workers who, particularly for women who are not able to access any kind of benefits in that kind of employment. And I think what it really shows is with these trade agreements, the basis of the agreement is the assumption that countries should focus on their competitive advantage and stop other industries. And what ends up happening is the competitive advantage goes from, as she mentioned, labour conditions where at least there was a minimum wage and some benefits, but the constant need to compete drives even those minimum provisions down into the types of environment that she spoke about, which is not about whether there is an availability of work, but it's about trying to drive down the wage costs as low as possible to compete. So before we go to other panelists, I'll take some questions because I know Andrew has to leave for another meeting. So I think there's a couple of questions already in the chat box, which are quite extensive. But Andrew, I can perhaps ask you to sort of give some responses. First of all, do you think that the RCEP will end up creating jobs, or will it, lead to displacement? Secondly, what will the possible recourse for unions or labour groups be? Like, is there a possibility to take it to the ILO or other international fora? And also, how will the pandemic affect the implementation? So, three quite large questions. I'll see, Andrew, if you would like to give any of those a shot.
Thanks very much, Kate. And can I say that was a fairly horrifying personal example of the impact of free trade agreements, and I hope that pregnancy goes well. These are, as you say, Kate, very large questions. The first one, though, I can answer quite simply. The RCEP, the limited analysis that has been done by the Australian government through the Department of Treasury indicates that free trade agreements, we always have governments talking up their benefits, talking up how many jobs are going to be created, how it's going to be such a good thing for the economy. In effect, the analysis that has been done of all the free trade agreements which have been concluded has been that the job increases have been either they have not been there, in fact there's been job losses, or they've been so infinitesimally small that they've been incapable of being measured. So we think that the RCEP will be of a piece with that. That is, that it will not result in any increase to our jobs, but instead will lead to job losses, and it will lead to further contraction of industries which have been affected by the pandemic, but also by this great idea of comparative advantage. We've seen the impact of comparative advantage in Australian industry, where supposedly if we stick to our rocks and crops, we'll be a successful economy. Unfortunately, what that denies is that the only successful economies in the world are the ones which have both a strong public infrastructure and a strong manufacturing sector. We don't need to go beyond Europe to know that to be the case. In terms of recourse for unions, the AMWU is a member of a number of global unions, the Industrial Global Union, we're not unfortunately of the PSI because we're pretty much a private sector union, of Uni Global, and also of the International Union of Food Workers. And through them, we have been seeking audiences, and of course, we have made our opposition clear with the various international regulators. And what we are saying is that we will not stop our opposition to these free trade agreements, regardless of whether or not the government of Australia signs us up to them. We have been successful in gaining approval and agreement from the Labor Party, which is our main opposition party, that various aspects of these free trade agreements which have been negotiated, such as those which include investor-state dispute settlement, will be revoked. Those elements of those free trade agreements will be revoked should the Labor Party come to power. That has been an ongoing commitment, and one on which we would insist that any incoming Labor government resolve to do. The only other question, I suppose, that I can touch upon is the impact of the pandemic on Australia. The impact is yet to be known. We need to be very clear that we have a government which, however ineptly, has decided to engage in a process of social protection and economic stimulus to try and ensure that the impact upon the Australian economy has not been that great. As I say, we may have some differences with that, but the issue of that process has been one where there has been a desire and generally agreed that those measures of economic stimulus and social protection have been welcomed and have led to a significant protection for Australian working people. The problem we have, though, is that the so-called deficit, which was something that the neoliberal project told us was something that could, deficits were incredibly bad. Well, we still have within government, from the Treasurer and Prime Minister on down, people who believe that deficits are bad. Despite the fact we are a wealthy country, despite the fact that we have significant ability to pay off any debt, and with record low interest rates of 0.1%, that is 0.1% interest rates, we nevertheless have people within government that say to us that there is still a need for us to rein in the deficit. We know that in a contractionary economy, that an expansionary economic and fiscal policy needs to be undertaken by any responsible government. Otherwise, the impact of the pandemic will be exacerbated. And the problem with our federal government is that they are going to cut back on that economic stimulus and social protection just at a time when the worst impacts of the pandemic and the recession that it is causing will impact upon the Australian economy. So the RCEP will come into this environment, and once implemented, should it be implemented, we hope that it won't be implemented, it will impact upon our economy again in a negative way, and which will lead to outcomes which we believe are just of great consequence for the Australian economy, most importantly for Australian workers and Australian society. They will all be negative.
Thanks, Andrew. If there are any other questions for Andrew, perhaps now there is the time to ask them, if anybody would like to put a hand up or chat. But just before we move on, I might ask you actually myself that obviously trade agreements are supposed to be all about deregulation, and that we have governments that don't believe in regulation, supposedly. But in fact, I think in Australia, the government does believe in significant regulation of trade unions. And, so I've heard this expressed as you deregulate your friends and you regulate your enemies. The other trade in the EU trade agreements often are accompanied by requirements to meet international standards, including ILO standards. And I understand that a number of parliamentarians in the EU raised concerns about the proposed Ensuring Integrity Bill before it was withdrawn from Parliament. But this, as you said, this trade agreement doesn't involve any kind of compliance with international standards. Yeah, I thought I might just ask you then to speak about how regulation, the kind of regulation that governments actually want, which does contravene international standards, has an impact on workers, and whether you've taken any of, whether you've approached EU, for example, in relation to those requirements that they have in the upcoming EU-Australia trade agreement.
Certainly. We have been in dialogue with the EU. Unlike the Australian government as currently constituted, the EU is open to consulting with trade unions. In fact, they have trade union representatives as part of their trade delegation. And that's a refreshing change. It's something which I think shows the importance of social partnership in any decent society. We do have a government which, as you say, regulates its enemies and deregulates its friends. I think it's been said on many occasions that these so-called free trade agreements are nothing of the sort. It's basically a series of political decisions to regulate certain elements and to not regulate others. So, for instance, as you say, Australian trade unions are regulated to within an inch of our existence. We have to undergo criminal history checks. We have to be putting in our accounts for verification. We have to provide balance sheets. We have to name the 5 top earning people within our trade union, and that is publicly available knowledge, and it is done nationally and on a state and territory basis. All of those things are public information which are required to be provided to an interested public, it would appear, because of what this federal government has decided. Of course, another element which impacts upon our members, especially in the construction industry, is the Australian Building and Construction Commission, which has powers which would make the secret police of some countries blink. They have a capacity to compel witnesses. They have the capacity to undertake secret investigations, and all of trade unions which are simply seeking to go about and improve workers' wages and conditions. So, as far as we are concerned, it is laughable to think that this is a government, or indeed it's a series of governments which have the interest of so-called deregulation. Again, an emblematic part of the neoliberal project. What we say is that, as you say, Kate, it is about regulating your enemies, and in fact that's the problem. They conceive of trade unions and workers' rights as being their enemies, and I think that the fact that they're prepared to sign up to a trade agreement which has no labour rights included in it, and will include countries like Brunei, in which you can be jailed for actually joining a trade union, shows the hollowness and the emptiness of any sort of workers' rights which are entailed within the RCEP.
Great, thank you, Andrew, and thanks very much for joining us. I will let you go if, and I guess I know you have another meeting, but we will be able to send through questions via email if anybody would like them as we prepare for the signing. I'm now actually going to move on to just change the order a little bit, and we have Charles Santiago, who's joined us from Malaysia. He's a member of Parliament, and he's been a long advocate for trade justice rather than free trade rules. He's also worked very closely with the trade union movement on labour rights within Malaysia, but also within the region. And he's also worked quite extensively on access to public services, particularly water. So we're very happy to have him join us to talk about the impact of the RCEP in Malaysia and in the region, and particularly on democracy, I think, and access to the inputs that democracies need. So over to you, Charles. Sorry, you're on mute, Charles.
Yeah, I just unmuted. Hi, Kate. It's been a long time. And friends, how are you? I don't have much time because Parliament works based on a clock, timetable. So I'm going to make a quick presentation, and I have to leave after that. The Minister of International Trade and Industry of Malaysia had come out with a statement, a public statement, saying that the RCEP is good for Malaysia, is good for the region, and more importantly, he made this argument that in this COVID-19 environment, it will help to promote trade, it will help to promote development for Malaysia as well as other developing countries that are part of the RCEP. Now, this is not surprising because this is the mantra of free trade, where the argument is that free trade agreements actually help to promote trade and help to promote uh, um, uh, um, uh, development, as well as helps to create jobs and so on and so forth. Now, clearly, we are not in normal times with the COVID virus. We're not in the normal times. We're in a very different moment. I'm trying to get my notes. Hold on. So the argument, it is not clear. I mean, when the minister made the statement, my quick reaction was, where is the argument coming from? I mean, where is the minister saying that Malaysia will actually benefit from the RCEP? Because there was no, we had asked for what you call the cost-benefit studies, cost-benefit analysis, which actually would indicate to Malaysia how Malaysia would benefit from this agreement. And as far as I know, and I've been watching the developments quite closely on RCEP, there has been no study done. Unlike the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, where Malaysia has done somewhat of a cost-benefit analysis, including a national interest study. But in the case of RCEP, there was no such study done to show that Malaysia indeed will benefit from the RCEP. I just like to point out here that recently UNTAD did a country-by-country goods market access analysis, and assuming that 100% of all listed goods go to zero tariff. This is a study done by UNTAD, and the result for Malaysia was, and it was pointed out, the result, Malaysia will experience import surges and end up with a negative goods trade balance. Now, clearly, if you go by what UNTAD is saying, then clearly Malaysia will not be benefiting from the RCEP. And when you have import surges, it is going to compete with local small or medium industries. So local, as it is, local SMEs as it is in the COVID environment is being devastated. It's literally devastated right now. And most of the shops, a good number of shops are closing down. So now you have a situation where you have a trade agreement that actually could make it worse. And what is worse is the government's hands in the way they respond to the crisis of the SMEs will actually be quite complicated, quite difficult, given that the government's role will be very tied down, will be very limited. So here you can clearly see that what the government can do and cannot do to protect its own interests, to protect its own national interests, protect its own small and medium industries is in question, is really in question. This is something that we have to keep in mind because if a government cannot protect its own citizens, if the government cannot protect its own small and medium industries, then what good is that government for? I think that's a question that we need to ask. And given there's a lack of consultation, a lack of negotiations between the various parties, including stakeholders, clearly we do not have a sense of what this agreement is about, even to say that, okay, there's some room for SMEs, there's some room for government's policy space. Clearly, it is not very clear because we really don't have a sense of what's in that agreement. Okay, that's my first point. My first point basically is that small and medium industries could be devastated, and the situation can get worse given the COVID crisis that we have, and government's hands might be tied to the point that they might not be able to respond effectively to local interests, and therefore, in that sense, negate national interest. The second point I would like to raise is the issue of policy space and intellectual property rights. Now, this is quite important, especially in the context of a COVID crisis that we are having, where countries after country is now talking about mass testing, And I would just like to share a study done by Third World Network, where they actually pointed out that in the case of Netherlands, the government of Netherlands wanted to implement this mass testing, but they could not go ahead with it because they had a shortage of what you call the reagents, I think. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but regions, I think. And there was a shortage of these regions, and they had no access to it. And the patent was held by a company called, a big pharmaceutical company called Roche. And as predicted, Roche said, we're not going to give it to you. We're not going to give it to you. This is really interesting. You have a pandemic, people are dying across the board, and the big corporations that has a patent to these regions are saying, I am not going to give it to you. That tells you the power of big corporations over governments, though. That tells you the power of corporations over governments. And finally, after massive pressure on Roche, when the government when the Dutch health minister said, okay, we're going to impose compulsory licensing. If you don't give us, we're going to impose compulsory licensing. And the pressure from the European Union, that forced Roche to open up the process and said, okay, now you can have it. I think this tells us a lot about the power of corporations, in through the intellectual property chapter, and how governments can respond to crises. This is scary though, because one, governments are held hostage. Governments that we elect, people elect, we talk about democracy. Governments that people elect are now being held hostage by big pharma. And clearly the motivation is profit. Even in a crisis, even in a pandemic, forget about a crisis, even in a pandemic, the issue of profitability seems to be the priority over anything else. Okay, so therefore, I think we need to ask, what is the motivations underlying the trade agreements, especially in the case of a crisis, in the case of a pandemic? Clearly, there is no caveat for people-centered approach, supporting governments when they need help, supporting a population when they need help. Clearly, there's no mention of that. It's all about regulating and regulating in the interest of profits. This is the answer that one can say, though. And clearly, IPR protects profits. IPR protects big companies. IPR protects big corporations over people and even over governments, because governments can't do it. And Netherlands government is not a poor government. It's not a less developing government. It's a rich government, though. It's a rich organization. It's a rich country. And it's an advanced country. But if the big pharma like Roche can hold that country hostage, what more about developing countries? What more about less developing countries? So clearly, you can see the biasness that is inherent in trade agreements that allows big corporations to run wild, even when there's a pandemic. And I think this is something that we need to keep in mind. And I think in this context, we need to support governments of India as well as South Africa, who have asked for some how do I say this, some space for them to bypass the existing intellectual property rights in order in the TRIPS agreement, so that they can protect national interests and the interests of the people. I think this is something that we need to do as a way to challenge the TRIPS agreement, as a way to challenge intellectual property rights, but more importantly, to challenge big corporations. These big agreements that we have, RCEP, the CTP, CPTPP, and so on, are really instruments that promote, or rules and regulations that promotes the rich countries, promotes the rich corporations. And therefore, I think this should be used as a way to challenge the big corporations. I'm going to stop here. And the point that I wanted to make, the 2 points I wanted to make is one, basically that smaller medium industries might be devastated and governments might not be able to respond effectively given the trade agreements that we have. Number two, that these agreements have been signed in secrecy, and therefore civil society, even parliaments, forget about civil society, even parliaments have no idea what the hell is being signed in the name of people, in the name of the country. So therefore, the secrecy involved, it is not helpful. And number three, big farmers, through the intellectual property rights, which we find in the trade agreements, are focused on profits and not governments, and no priority to governments, even during and people even during a pandemic. I will stop here, and I have to run from now on because I have to take a vote very soon, and I need to leave this place.
Oh, no. Okay,
Thanks,
thank
Kate.
you, Charles. There are a couple of questions here, but I guess we could either email you or
Sure,
if
do
you've
that.
got a
Please do
couple.
that. Please do that.
All right. All
Thank
right.
you very much. I'm sorry about running, but
No, it's good to get your perspective, and yeah, thanks for making the time for us, and hope that when all of this, we're able to travel again, we get to see you at some point again.
Yes,
But
at some
thanks
point.
for
Though.
joining.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Okay, now I think on our next speaker has actually dropped off as well. We had Liam from New Zealand from the Education Union there, but I might see if I can see a couple of comments or questions, perhaps more comments in the chat box here, which I think is really important to at this time to clarify that the waiver that India and South Africa are proposing at the World Trade Organization to enable all countries to have access to COVID medicines and devices is being blocked by a number of countries, and particularly the most developed countries, or the most wealthy countries, I should say, who are siding with big pharma rather than people to ensure that that TRIPS agreement, the intellectual property provisions, are retained, and rather than agree that everybody should have access to the information that goes into medicines. There was a question about UNCTAD, so I think from Joshua, that UNCTAD showed that all ASEAN countries would have balance of payment problems if they sign up to the RCEP, and nonetheless ASEAN governments intend to sign. So why is that bizarre? I mean, I think that's a perpetual problem that others might like to comment on. In fact, I can see a couple of people. Would anybody like to make, I can see a few people that are present that may have perspectives on that. So before we wind up, if anybody would like to contribute to answering these questions, given our speakers had to run off, I'd be happy to open up. Either about, particularly either in relation to why governments are doing this when the evidence is clear that it doesn't have a financial benefit, let alone obviously the constraints on policy space, or secondly in relation to the waiver, which I think is an important emerging issue that needs further attention, why governments are signing these deals but not agreeing to use the policy space, at least that, or the flexibilities that might exist that should allow countries to allow for access to medicines. I mean, if that provision was ever created, now is the time to use it. Sorry, I see Tony Salvador, if you would like to speak.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. I just want to answer Joshua's question about why governments actually sign, even though apparently it's not to their interest to do so. I think it was touched upon also by Andrew and even Charles earlier on. It's basically this neoliberal thinking. It's basically, it's like religions, like faith. They want to send a signal to the whole world that, for example, such and such developing country is open for business, wants to attract investors, etc., etc. And one of the metrics that investors look at is that if a country has open borders, has a free trade agreement, And of course, there's this mistake being perpetually committed by many countries, especially developing countries, that they, in order to have market access to the markets of developed countries, they would have to open their borders to services, to different goods, to investments. Although the studies show that the ability to attract investments do not come from free trade agreements, do not come from and what was touched on earlier on, by our sister in Cambodia, do not come from tax breaks and tax holidays. They come from a host of different issues such as infrastructure, education, internal market, etc., etc. So I think it's basically neoliberalism. It's this kind of thinking that's making developing countries sign these free trade agreements. Thank you. I hope it
Thanks.
answers.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Thanks, Tony. I mean, I think that there's been a question about access to the UNCTAD study, and I think that is an important resource. As far as I'm aware, that UNCTAD study that hasn't, although it's been presented, it's not available online yet. So I think we might want to see if we can get the presentation from the UNCTAD researcher and share it with anybody that would like to cover that element. One thing that I found very interesting about the UNCTAD study was that they looked specifically at the impact on imports and exports and you know, on the balance of payments of each country, but they didn't look at the other chapters in terms of the other negative impacts that could possibly arise, or the future policy space. And there are, as far as we know, because of course we have to look at leaked chapters or the very limited amount of information that comes from governments. There are chapters in here that have, of course, nothing to do with trade, but could have very long-term impacts, including one on e-commerce and the capacity of governments to regulate the big tech industry, which of course are also profiting extensively from the pandemic, have been able to find ways to avoid taxes and are increasingly able to profit from the metadata that they've been able to collect during this time, with many, you know, with an extensive or an increasing use of big tech applications. So yeah, but Susanna has said that we can share the presentation to the UNCTAD study and perhaps also the email of the researcher who's provided the information to us. Are there any other comments or questions before we close? As well as, sorry, there's also a Third World Network study, and that's in the chat box there, which is also looking at similar kind of metrics. Okay, well, finally, if I don't, sorry, I'm just scrolling through to see if there are any hands up. If there are no further comments or questions, the last thing I have to do is to alert everybody to the statement that was jointly put together by the global unions in the region, in the Asia Pacific region, which raises a number of concerns that we all have collectively and around our separate industries. And that, I think, will be available on the Unions for Trade Justice website. Of course, if there's any further release where we actually get information about, you know, we get the text of the RCEP, we will update our position. But at this stage, I think it's very clear that across the region, all the union movement, no matter which sector, is very much opposed to signing this trade agreement. Right now, of course, is the worst time, but at no point in time would this trade agreement, as far as the information that we have, be something that would be in the interests of workers or communities. It will drive inequality, and it'll restrict our capacity to have a more democratic and fair societies in the future. Susanna's just posted that link, and yeah, I encourage you to access it. This virtual press conference has been recorded, so we can provide some of the material and also links to the speakers if anybody would like. And so if there are no further questions or comments, I'll thank everybody for making the time. Apologise that we had to change the time up and the speakers a little bit and that we missed Liam. But yeah, let's all try and participate in the actions that will be arising from the signing of the RCEP. I believe that ActionAid and some other civil society groups are inviting people to take action through some photo campaign, and we encourage our affiliates to participate in that. So thanks again. Thank you for our interpreter Sita helping out to make sure that we could hear the position, the situation that workers in Cambodia have. And thanks for my colleagues Susanna and Tramita for organising it, and all our speakers.